On Monday, Google fired software engineer James Damore, the author of the viral internal memo called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber: How Bias Clouds Our Thinking About Diversity and Inclusion, in which he argues that Google's dominating political bias has established certain ideas that are too sacred to be honestly discussed, and that differences in traits between men and women at least in part explain why there isn't a 50-50 split between men and women in tech, and specifically at Google. In an email with Breitbart Tech, Damore says the specific reason for his firing was, quote, perpetuating gender stereotypes. And while Google won't comment on individual employees, the phrasing is similar to that used by Google CEO Sundar Pichai in a company-wide email saying portions of the memo violate Google's code of conduct and cross the line by advancing harmful gender stereotypes in the workplace. To suggest a group of our colleagues have traits that make them less biologically suited to work is offensive and not okay, he writes. All of this controversy and pushback, despite the fact that the very first complete sentence in Damore's memo is "I value diversity and inclusion. I'm not denying that sexism exists and don't endorse using stereotypes." All Damore argues is that on average, men and women tend to choose different things. That on average, women tend to have more openness directed toward feelings and aesthetics over ideas, preferring people over things. Women tend to be extroverted and gregarious rather than assertive. Women tend to have higher anxiety and lower stress tolerance, and that men tend to have a higher drive for status. Damore emphasizes that many of these differences are small and there's significant overlap between men and women, so you can't say anything about the individual given these population averages. Indeed, his suggestion is to treat people as individuals, not just another member of their group, but the differences are significant enough that we need to consider them and stop assuming that any gender gaps imply sexism. And that's the argument I want to focus on, because given the facts and the gender breakdown at Google, one of two things must be true. Either Google's massive company-wide efforts to diversify its workforce and hire more women have failed, and the company's diversity-loving executive team is in fact sexist, keeping women disproportionately out of most jobs at the company. Or Damore is onto something, and that men and women choose different things on average, and so there's no reason to suppose that unequal distribution of men and women within the company is evidence of discrimination. Google has made diversity a focal point of its corporate philosophy, its hiring and workplace policies, and externally in education and community outreach. A diverse mix of voices leads to better discussions, decisions, and outcomes for everyone, says the CEO. This philosophy is reflected in the company's leadership. 6 out of Google's 13 executives are women. In June, Google hired a new dedicated diversity chief in an effort to make its workforce better reflect the panoply of people it serves around the globe. And yet, despite this major effort, despite every voice in corporate leadership repeating the company line about the unquestionable value of superficial diversity, there are still massive gender inequalities within Google's workforce. So much so that earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Labor filed a lawsuit against the company for what a Labor Department regional director described as extreme pay discrimination, even for the tech industry. In response, Eileen Naughton, Google's VP for People Operations and presumably one of Google's female discrimination victims, emphasized that men and women who join Google in the same role are compensated on a level playing field. That when you control for the same job or job category at Google, there is no gender pay gap within the company. A Glassdoor analysis confirmed this conclusion, but found that overall at Google, women earn 16% less than men, because men and women are not equally represented among job titles within the company. So men and women are doing different jobs at Google, not being paid differently for doing the same job, a difference plausibly explained by the hateful idea that men and women often choose to do different things. In fact, Google's own own employee demographic data are right in line with those choices. Of Google's tech jobs, 80% of the workforce is male, a number entirely consistent with the gender breakdown of Americans earning bachelor's degrees in computer science. 82% male, according to U.S. Department of Education data. So if we have all of this top-down effort to diversify Google's workforce, including the hiring of a vice president tasked with the sole responsibility of making that happen, and yet all of the power and resources of one of the world's most valuable companies are insufficient to get jobs at Google close to a 50-50 split between men and women, it seems to me Google must admit to one of two things. Either the gender differences we observe within the company are the product of the sexism of Google's overtly anti-sexist intersectional leadership team, or James Damore has a point. Either sexism is so strong, even within a team of powerful individuals assembled for the specific purpose of defeating it, or, even with all things being equal, men and women tend to choose different things. And that's okay. I'd like to get an answer from Google's leadership, though I'm sure we won't. But if you fired Damore for having the audacity to suggest the differences we observe are the products of tendencies on average and individual choices, presumably you do that because you disagree with the idea so strongly that you find it unacceptable. If so, the only thing you have left to explain the observable differences between men and women within your company is, apparently, your own sexism. Put another way, we know that men and women are distributed unequally at Google, and according to Google, it's unacceptable to suggest they might choose that distribution. The only conclusion left is that Google has orchestrated that inequality, rather than that inequality being natural. Now, I don't think that's the case, but Google has rejected the alternative explanation. For a company so explicitly opposed to sexism, Google has left sexism as the only acceptable explanation for how the company operates and the inequalities we can observe. It's not the conclusion I would reach, but it is the conclusion Google's leadership has boxed itself into reaching. Given the premises in this case that there is gender inequality at Google and that James Damore was fired for suggesting there may be a natural explanation for it, the relevant question is not, why does James Damore hate women so much? The relevant question is, why does Google hate women so much? It's not a question I would normally ask, but since you're forcing me to ask it, Google, I look forward to your response. But I'm not holding my breath. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it.